Hello, I'm Dennis Tucker. I appreciate you tuning into this program. I preach for the Lilac Road Church of Christ. We want to do a Bible study right now, kind of take a look at a character in the Bible. Regina and I have been reading through the Bible as we have done for a number of years now, kind of done a chronological reading. And as I was doing that, I came across somebody that I knew was there, but had not really thought about a whole lot. And he's not mentioned in a lot of passages, but the ones that he's mentioning is a pretty important person. And that is a man by the name of Jethro. Now, to kind of date myself a little bit, kind of sideline here, really not related to the topic at hand, but every time I think of Jethro, I think of Jethro Bodine. Kind of dating myself because of the Beverly Hillbillies, and that Jethro was about as smart as a fence post. I mean, he wasn't really a bright person. I forget how many years it took him to get out of sixth grade before he graduated sixth grade, and that was the end of his education. This Jethro is noted for a number of reasons, and as I started my study, I thought about the fact that he's Moses' father-in-law. However, this is really not just a father-in-law lesson. There's some things we can notice between the relationship of Jethro and Moses that'd be interesting, but really a lot of what I notice about him doesn't really relate to the father-in-law aspect as far as some other parts of Jethro's life. Now, you look in the Bible, you find that I believe Jethro is referred to as another name also, and that is Reuel, R-E-U-E-L. And Exodus 2, verse 16, it said, "Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters. They came and they drew water and filled the troughs to water the father's flock." Now that's going to be that priest of Midian there is going to be the father-in-law of Moses eventually. But in verse 18 it said, "Then they came to rule their father." And so in putting verse 16 and 18 together here in Exodus 2nd chapter, we find that Reuel is another name for Jethro. I know I was reading some commentaries, some other sources that have some arguments against that. Really, I don't understand it. But that seems to be very obvious, the fact that this man had another name. Now, that's a side point. Again, really not that important. But what's important is, first of all, this is after Moses had grown up in Pharaoh's household. Exodus 1st chapter kind of explains how that happens. And then the 2nd chapter explains to us, the first part of that 2nd chapter explains to us how Moses knew about his Israelite heritage, but one day he goes out to observe the Hebrews, and basically he winds up killing a slave master. And so because of that, he has to run away from Egypt. And as it does so, he goes to a place called Midian. And Midian, if you have a map, just think about where Egypt is today. You have Egypt on the west side of the Nile River, and then if you go towards the east, you have this big desert wasteland, kind of Saudi Arabia. Well, Midian's over east of that a little bit, a good ways off. And so that's where Moses runs off to. And although there's really not a whole lot of talk about this, we understand that there's times we look and think, well, that is divine providence. And that is God working through natural means to accomplish his goal. And so as you think about Midian and Moses going that direction, he comes across these daughters, these women, and this priest. And the priest describes him as the priest of Midian. I notice there in Exodus 2, verse 16. So now the priest of Midian. If you go down in Exodus 3, verse 1, now Moses attended to the flock of Jethro's father-in-law, the priest of Midian. And I just kind of noticed that, and maybe it's just a technical distinction again, but it doesn't say a priest of Midian, but the priest of Midian, and what it says there. And so we're not really sure a whole lot about this man's priesthood. I'll put it like that. I understand that Melchizedek, for instance, over in the Exodus, around the 18th chapter, I believe it is, maybe 16th chapter, someplace in that area, that Melchizedek is described as being a priest of God, a priest most high of Salem, which is actually the Old Testament reference to Jerusalem. And here Melchizedek was recognized as being a faithful priest of God. This during the time of the patriarchal age, where God talked directly to the heads of the families. Well, the same thing here in Exodus, a little bit later on, we're going to see that God starts speaking to the nation of Israel through Moses, but And this time, everybody's still under the patriarchal dispensation. And so God is still talking directly to the priests or to the heads of the families. And it's possible that basically that Jethro was a faithful priest of God. We also know that Midian was an idolatrous country, as many other countries were. Idolatry is very prominent in Egypt and other places. And so that's just kind of, again, kind of get you thinking about the fact that here's a priest, here's described as a priest of Midian. And also what we see about this man, just kind of background information again, is he has 7 daughters. And it says that they were shepherdesses, basically. And going back to Exodus 2, verse 16, and they said they came and drew water and they filled their troughs with the water of the father's flock. So they were tending to the father's animals, their flock. And as doing that, they faced an obstacle. As you look over in Exodus 2, verse 17, and by the way, about everything we're studying here in this lesson will be out of Exodus. So right now, just kind of put your hand in the 2nd chapter, and in a little while I'll tell you where to go as far as another chapter. But here in Exodus 17, first part of that said that then the shepherds came and drove them away. And that is that the other shepherds were not very good to these girls, to these women. And so they had this problem, obstacle here of having to do with the other shepherds. And then that's where Moses comes on hand. Moses comes to their aid. Last part of Exodus 2, verse 17. But Moses stood up and helped them and watered their flock. And so as you look at this here, just kind of, there's a lot of side notes in this lesson, I realize that. But one of those is, it's amazing when you start reading through Genesis and now in Exodus, that a good way of finding a future husband and wife seems to be going to a well during that time period. But as you look at over in Genesis 24th chapter, Abraham is tells his servant to go back to his homeland, go to Ur Chaldees and find a wife for Isaac. And the servant winds up in Exodus 24, verse 11, going to the well and making a prayer to God as far as finding a wife for Isaac. And here comes Rebekah. If you go over to Genesis 29, chapter, verse 10, you're dealing with Jacob. And Jacob has to run away because he had tricked his father into blessing him. And basically tricked Isaac into blessing him instead of Esau. And when Esau finds this out, Esau is angry with Jacob and he's going to kill him. And so Jacob goes back into his home country, the country of his father Abraham. And you find in Genesis 29, verse 10, that in this case here, you have another wife that shows up. And that is that Rachel shows up. And so it's just a kind of interesting way of kind of just noticing how it seemed like this was a place to find a wife or find a husband. And I think we can make an observation about that. First of all, is that if you want to find a worker, then what do? Look for somebody who's working. If you want to find somebody to do a job, look for somebody who's already doing a job. And that person there has proven themselves to be a worker. Well, if you want a godly spouse, and that's where I'm going with this, if you want a godly spouse, go to places where godly people go. Okay, that there's not an accident, I think, that both times that these men were looking for women or looking for a wife, basically they went to a place where people are working, where women would be to work. And so that's one thing. Now, my point number one, though, about Jethro at this point in this lesson is Jethro's reaction, because his daughters come back and he tell their father about this man and what he done for them, helped the water flock. And over in Exodus 2, verse 20, he said to his daughters, "Where is he? Why is it you have let the man? Call him that he may eat bread." That is, Jethro recognized something right here. And that is, Jethro recognized a hard worker. He recognized, I noticed that apparently none of the other men in that area in Midian had helped his daughters. This was a man that did that. And therefore, Jethro eventually gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses as wife. And again, I don't think that's an accident. I don't think that was done haphazardly. Jethro wanted somebody that could provide for his daughter and provide for the family. And Moses is showing that ability and being willing to work. Okay, so that's the first point. He recognized a person that's willing to work. The second thing as you go on in our story is that, okay, so Moses spends 40 years tending to the flocks and being around Jethro and having his family. And then we kind of pick up, and that is Moses, of course, is told by God, go back to the land of Egypt and tell Pharaoh, let my people go. We understand there are 10 plagues eventually that occur because Pharaoh's not willing to do that. And then Moses' children of Israel leave Egypt and go out into the wilderness. At that point, in Exodus 18 chapter, kind of fast forward to Exodus 18 chapter, verse 1, it said, and Jethro, the priest of Midian, Moses' father-in-law, heard of all that God had done for Moses and for Israel, his people, that the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. Then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took Zipporah, Moses' wife, after he had sent her back. So here we have Jethro, is what I want to focus on, that he recognized the work of God in what happened in Egypt. By the way, a lot of times we may think, well, things that were happening like in Egypt, did the other nations around see that thing? Did they understand maybe the plagues, maybe the darkness, death of firstborn? I tend to think yes, that this was not done in a bottle, that Jethro here recognized the work of God and comes to meet Moses in the wilderness. And notice in verse 5 then. And Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came with his sons, his wife, to Moses in the wilderness, where he camped at the mountain of God. So that'd be Mount Sinai. Now he has said to Moses, I, your father-in-law, Jethro, am come to you with your wife and 2 sons with her. So they're coming to meet them. As you go down verse 17, I see a warm relationship between Jethro and Moses. In verse 7, so Moses went out to meet his father-in-law, bowed down and kissed him, and they asked each other about their well-being, and they went into the tent. That, as I said before, Moses spent 40 years in Midian, not a short time period. And so 40 years is a good while to get to learn somebody, get to know somebody, and they had developed this good friendship between each other, more than simply a father-in-law, son-in-law, but it appears to be a friendship, a camaraderie, a respect for each other. And some people, as you think about in-laws, about whether son-in-laws or daughter-in-laws or father-in-laws or mother-in-laws, some people, some of those relationships can be strained. In fact, we already had an example of that in the Bible in Genesis between Jacob and Laban, where they really had an odd relationship with each other, a distrust, and kind of take advantage of each other. And as we have relationships with people, and maybe this is the part that does deal with the idea of being a father-in-law or being a daughter-in-law or son-in-law and mother-in-law, is that we should be all working together. And it's easier if both of you are serving God. It's easier if you have the common bond of serving God. The thing that did bind Jacob and Laban together is that Laban recognized that Jacob had his daughters and that those children out there were Jacob's children, but Laban's grandchildren. And so there seemed to be a bond between those two because of that. But as I look around, and when our daughter Noah got married, I really hadn't thought about it much, but I observed a good friend of mine and the relationship he had with his son-in-law. And both are godly men, but I just recall him kind of saying that, that his son-in-law that they had a good relationship and he had made up his mind they were not going to have any kind of antagonistic relationship. They weren't going to have any kind of rivalry or any kind of pettiness between them. And they have a real close relationship with each other. And so that was my goal. And I've been thankful that I have a son-in-law and I have a daughter-in-law, and they are our children. They are part of our family. And so what we observe here, why observe Moses and Jacob, is they had that kind of relationship. And then as you go on in verse 9 of Exodus 18 chapter, and by the way, just kind of put your hand here in Exodus 18 because that's where we're staying. In verse 9 it said, then Jethro rejoiced for all the good which the Lord had done for Israel, whom he had delivered out of the hand of the Egyptians. This deliverance was to Israel, not the Midianites, but rejoiced in what God had done for Israel. He gave God the credit. But also he recognized this was for Israel's people. He recognized the true God and what he had done for his people, Israel. And to me, that is amazing because here, in one sense, we think, well, Jethro didn't have a dog in this fight. Jethro was an Israelite. He's a Midianite. He recognized the work of God. That's the key here. As you go down in verse 11 of Exodus 18, it said, "Now I know that the Lord is greater than all the gods, for in the very thing which they have behaved proudly, he was above them." If there's any doubt about Jethro's priesthood, while in Midian, that's erased by now. Because the very next verse says, then Jethro, verse 12, then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, took a burnt offering and another sacrifice to offer to God, and Aaron with all the elders of Israel to eat bread with Moses' father-in-law before God. Let's just look at that again, break that down a little bit. Jethro's father-in-law, Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, took a burnt offering, another sacrifice to offer to God. He's acting as a priest. Again, before Mount Sinai, before the Levitical priesthood established, he's acting as a priest to God. And he's serving in essence? Aaron and the elders of Israel. And so he is a priest to God now. No longer, and just, I don't think that's referred to as a Midianite priest anymore. So point number 2, Jethro served God on God's conditions. People often want to serve God on their own condition. And you know what I mean? People have said, I will serve God if, and then they have some kind of condition that they believe God has fulfilled, and if he does that, then they'll serve him. And maybe that I'll serve God if my loved one, maybe my loved one is sick and really on the verge of death. And you know what? If God would spare their life, I'll serve them then. You're not conditioned to try to put conditions on God. Or I'll serve God if I can stay in this relationship, whatever it may be. Maybe you're not married to somebody. Well, if I could just keep on in that relationship. Maybe it's a homosexual relationship. Maybe it's a relationship where you have one woman and two husbands, or one husband and two wives. And somebody said, I'll serve God if I can stay in that relationship. You're not in a position to make conditions on God. Or I'll serve God if I can keep on doing this, whatever it is. If I can keep on being alcoholic, or keep on, and just whatever sin you want to think of, I'll serve God as long as I don't have to give that up. Again, it's not based on us placing conditions on God. That's what people are doing when they say, I'll serve God if. Jethro is serving God on God's conditions. And we have to just keep this in mind. The conditions of serving God for us are not negotiable. When we talk about believing that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, that's not subject to change. That's not subject to if that is what your culture says, or if that is what the people around you believe. Now, if you believe that Muhammad is the Son of God, then that's okay if you're over there in the Middle East. No, that's not a condition that we could change. Repenting of our sins is not conditional. It's not a case I say, well, I'm sorry, but I'm not going to repent. I'm not going to stop that sin I'm involved in. We're not in a position of making conditions on God. Confessing Christ as Son of God is not a matter of interpretation. It is what Jesus says, unless you confess him before men, I'll confess him before our Father in heaven. But he who denies him before men, I'll deny him before my Father in heaven. That's not a condition. That's not a matter of interpretation. Baptism is not optional. And I talk about baptism for remission of sins, being immersed for remission of sins, as the people were told to on the day of Pentecost in Acts 2, verse 38. That was not optional. That you could be baptized if it's convenient, or you could be baptized if you think you should, but otherwise don't worry about it. No, that's not optional. Obedience is not just for some. It's not just for a select group. But if you want to go to heaven, all of us have to be obedient to God. And so Jethro is serving God on God's conditions. That's something we need to learn today. And it's going, though, in Exodus 18 chapter. So one of the last point I want to make here, and that is, so when Moses fought, in verse 14, of Exodus 18, verse 14, we'll pick up there again. So when Moses' father-in-law saw all that he had did for the people, he said, what is this thing you're doing for the people? Now, let me back up and kind of explain. Between 12 and 6:14, we read that Moses is basically acting as a judge for the nation of Israel. Let me say that again. For the nation of Israel. For everybody. Now, Israel by this time is a huge nation. Depending on calculations, you could say 1.5 million men. Some say that by the time you add in women and children, this could have been easily a group of 6 million people. Now you stop to think about that mass amount of humanity, the size of the camp of Israel, how many acres they would have, have been camping on. We read about them camping. Somebody has said about the size of Rhode Island as far as their camp itself. And then they don't have disputes because people are people. There don't be people who says, I got something against this guy or this person did this and that person said I did not. And so they had these disputes between each other, and they're coming before Moses. And as they're doing that, you can imagine, first of all, Moses, by doing this, is taking up a lot of time. And the people are having to wait to see Moses. So that's why we pick up here in verse 14. Let me read that again. So when Moses' father-in-law saw all that he did for the people, he said, what is the thing you're doing for your people? Why do you sit alone and all the people stand before you from morning until evening, all day? And Moses said to his father, because people have come to me to inquire of God. When they have difficulty, they come to me, and I judge between one another, and I make known the statutes of God and his laws. So Moses is serving as a leader. He's their figurehead, and he's the one God appointed. He's the one leading the children of Israel. He is God's spokesman. Okay, now he's telling the people what God said, and he's also acting as a judge. And again, you just consider the size of Israel and the complaints you would hear and the hours of listening and just the stress of the whole situation on both Moses and the people. Because again, from morning until evening. And so in verse 17, Jethro says to Moses that this thing you're doing, that's not good. That's not good. So he gives Moses some wise counsel. Now, by this time, Moses and Jethro again have gotten to know each other, and as we read earlier, that they have mutual respect for each other, and so they had to build a relationship with each other. That Jethro could come to him and say, what you're doing is not good. Sometimes with people, as maybe we're trying to talk to somebody or trying to correct somebody, we have to realize that's going to go a lot better if we have the right relationship with that person. And I've kind of mentioned this in other lessons, maybe not on YouTube, but other lessons I've given, that I'm at Walmart, and maybe the lady in front of me has a child that's misbehaving. And we've all seen it before, where the child is screaming, kicking, crying, and the woman is at her wits end. And we feel like telling the woman, lady, you need to get a hand on that child. You need to do something about that child. But you know what? We're strangers. And like I say it, what's the chances she's going to listen to me? It's a lot better if I know her, if we have a relationship where we can talk to each other. And the same thing about man and whatever we're talking about. You have to have the right relationship to be able to tell some people some things. And Moses and Jethro had that relationship. And so Jethro then gives him, I believe, 3 main words of advice here. First of all, teach them. In verse 20, I shall teach them the statutes and laws and show them the way in which they must walk and the work they must do. Teaching requires time. And teaching requires patience, and teaching requires effort. But again, if you think about your children, either you teach them, and yes, it may take longer to teach them, but from then on, they will know. And you don't have to keep on doing it over again. If you keep on just doing things over and over again without teaching them, you'll always be doing it. And so he says, first of all, you need to teach these people the Word of God. The second thing says, you need to appoint men that are qualified. Verse 21, Moses shall select from all the people able men, such as fear God, men of truth, hating covetousness, and place such over them to be rulers of thousands, rulers of hundreds, rulers of 50s, and rulers of 10. Now you have actually four kind of qualifications here. One is to fear God. Does mean they have reverence for Him. They are serious minded. New Testament and talk about elders and deacons. You sometimes use the word sober minded, and what that means is that these men take their job seriously. The second is that they are men of truth. That they value the truth. They want the truth. That when you teach somebody, but they don't value truth, it's not going to matter. You can teach them the truth and they'll value it. The third thing is they're not covetous. That means not being open to bribes, basically, in the case of being judges. And so they're not going to rule in favor of somebody because they may get something out of it. They may receive some kind of money out of it. And we also see kind of a sense of organization. And at that point, it says you don't have almost like a court system where you're going to have somebody's going to be over tens, and then somebody's going to go over rulers of 50s, and then hundreds and thousands. And so it's kind of the easy cases will get decided maybe in the area of the tens, and maybe a little bit harder cases go to the areas of the 50s, and then you kind of grow up to another stage, the hundreds and thousands, and finally only the hardest cases will go before Moses. And so there's a sense of organization there. And then the third thing says, let them do their task. In verse 22. And let them judge the people at all times. Then it will be that every great matter they shall bring to you, but every small matter they themselves shall judge. So it shall be easier for you, for they will bear the burden with you. That first part, let them judge. And that is, you let them take care of the job they have before them. It reminds me, in the New Testament, Acts 6 chapter, where the Christians at Jerusalem were having a problem because you had these helpless widows that are being neglected in the day of distribution in Acts 6 chapter. And so people come to the apostles and points this out to them. And the apostle said, we don't need to stop doing our job so let's take care of tables, take care of food. You select men, and they gave them qualifications, and you had them take care of the daily distribution. Well, really, that's kind of what's happening here, and that is you select men that are qualified, and you let them do the job. And there's, I think, lessons for us both in the family, as far, again, teaching them the truth and giving them opportunities to do things. Workplaces. Right now, whenever I was going for a master's degree, I found the idea of work groups, teamwork. It's talked about a lot more than what it was when I was first time in college. But the whole idea is you have the team get together or work together and to get the job done. Congregations. You appoint men to do a job and you make sure they're qualified, but you let them do the job. It's basically what we have here. And that's wise counsel for anybody. And so, as just kind of in here, Jethro and Moses had a special relationship. They were in-laws. Well, we can learn from each other. You know, we learn something about their relationship from them. But all of us need to recognize the true God and rejoice in the salvation and be ministers of God, and also be able to give wise counsel. And Jethro had that ability. So, kind of an interesting person to me to study about. And I hope maybe you kind of learn some things from this here. And feel free to contact me about any questions you may have or a subject you may want to hear discussed in this program. Be glad to talk about it. If you can, come be with us, Lilac Road, Church of Christ. Our building is located at 1687 Lilac Road, Litchfield, Kentucky. On Sunday mornings, Bible classes at 9:30, worship at 10:25. Sundays at 5 p.m. we have worship, and on Wednesday nights we have Bible classes at 7 p.m. I appreciate you watching. I hope you have a good week.